We're going to be looking at the question, am I just my brain? We're probably asking lots of different questions after lunch, particularly if you had quite a lot of carbohydrate, as I did. Hopefully we will, this will be a helpful look at the subject of the human brain. And those of you that are studying neuroscience in some way at school will probably know that our understanding of the human brain has grown hugely in the last few decades. In the course of my own lifetime, huge leaps forward in the understanding of the human brain have been made. The brain is an incredible thing. It takes up 2% of the body's energy, but it takes up 2% of total body weight, but uses 20% of the body's energy. I've actually had the privilege of studying the human brain up close, and you'll be slightly perturbed to know that it's not unlike the consistency of mushroom. But rest assured, you do not have mushroom between your ears. The human brain contains more cells than there are stars in the sky, roughly 100 billion. Brain activity contains energy pulsing through it to power an LED light at any one moment. And it is constantly forming new connections and pathways. And our understanding of the brain has grown hugely over the last 3 decades, especially through modern brain mapping and imaging. And this technology revolutionized our ability to study the brain because it meant that you can look inside the brain of healthy volunteers. You don't just need to wait until someone has died of a horrible death and then dissect their brain, or use people who are so ill and so desperate that they're willing to try anything. You can actually look inside the brain of a healthy person using brain imaging techniques such as MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, and others. And I spent 11 years in functional MRI research, working with all kinds of different people, cancer patients, and drug addicts at one point. And so this has been a huge part of my own journey and my own story. Now, some neuroscientists and philosophers are saying that neuroscience is not simply a helpful way to understand the workings of the human brain. They are saying that neuroscience can explain the person, and that everything that it means to be a human being can ultimately be explained in terms of brain chemistry and electrical activity. In other words, you are your brain. And some very smart people believe this. For example, Professor Sir Colin Blakemore, a professor of neuroscience at Oxford and a Royal Society Fellow, in his Wreath Lectures in 1976, he said this. He said, "The human brain is a machine which alone accounts for all our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are the products of the activity of our brains." And you say something in the academy, and a few decades later, it starts to come out at a popular level, and our movies are starting to espouse this viewpoint as well. Perhaps some of you have seen this fun animation, Inside Out. I've watched it several times with my children. It's a really fun and creative movie about the complexity of the human brain, the role of the different emotions such as anger, disgust, joy, sadness, and fear, the importance of not suppressing sadness, the joy that can come from not suppressing sadness, and also the plasticity in the brain. The brain is known to be incredibly plastic, and this movie demonstrates it very well through these islands that break and reform. Anyone seen the movie? Excellent. However, the core message of the movie, perhaps subconsciously, is that everything that makes Riley, this girl, who she is, comes from processes and structures inside her head. And when those core memories and the different islands are intact, Riley is together on the outside. But when they are not, then her outside world falls apart. There is only inside out. There is no outside in. And this is the message that is coming through. You might be asking, okay, well, so what? What difference does it make to what you believe about the human brain? Well, it actually matters a lot. In fact, all kinds of things are at stake and hinge around the answer you give to the question, "I just my brain?" For example, if you are simply your brain, then who makes the choices? Are you really free to make genuine choices, or does your brain make them for you? And if that is true, that your brain makes them for you, then can you hold anyone responsible for something that they've done wrong, or reward someone for something that they have done right? There are all kinds of implications for moral responsibility and then justice on top of that. Secondly, what is a person then? If it is true that you are simply your brain, does this mean personhood is dependent on having a fully functioning, healthy brain? And yet you and I know that this is not fully developed in newborn infants, in fetuses, and we also know that the brain can be damaged in the mentally handicapped and in those with degenerative diseases such as dementia and Alzheimer's. Does that mean if you are suffering from Alzheimer's that you are less of a person, that you decrease in your personhood as your brain degenerates? Or is there an essential you that does not change even though your brain does? Thirdly, is religious belief all in the brain? Is religious experience just brain activity? All kinds of studies have been carried out in the last few decades of what's happening in the brain when people pray. And this is an area where neuroscience intersects theology and has been very imaginatively termed neurotheology. But is religious belief just brain activity? And Marilyn Robinson, essayist, in her book Absence of Mind, points out the importance of this question by saying, whoever controls the definition of the mind controls the definition of humankind itself. Now you will have noticed that I've begun talking about the brain, and now we're talking about the mind. Well, what is the relationship? What is the brain, and what is the mind? And how do the two work together? You see, at the heart of this conversation, there are two different things at play. There is the brain with its cells that generate activity that powers an LED light with synapses and junctions and chemicals. That's the brain. And then there is the mind. Your thoughts, your memories, feelings, emotions, and decisions. And what is the relationship between the brain and the mind? Well, that is the million-dollar question that has stumped philosophers for centuries. And how do you get from brain cells to thoughts? And so what I want to do in this lecture is outline a number of different views to show you that actually you are far more than your brain. But I want to start by highlighting the initial problem. So this is just highlighting the mind-brain problem. How do you get from brain cells to your thoughts? I wonder what's for tea. That's going on in your head as well. Is that just going on in your brain, or is that going on somewhere else and interacting with your brain? This is a highly complex question, but the answer that you give to the relationship between the mind and the brain is really key. So the first view, the view that we've been looking at so far, is that the mind is the brain. There is actually no mind. There is only brain cells and electrical activity in the brain. There is no mind as such. Your thoughts are reducible to chemical activity in the brain. End of story. And this is known as physicalism, specifically reductive Physicalism, which says that only physical things exist and they explain everything. And your mind is reducible to physical processes in the brain. And Francis Crick, the British physicist and biochemist who co-discovered the structure of DNA with James Watson and won the Nobel Prize in 1962, he held this view, and he said this: your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons. How do you feel about that? How should we respond to this view? Well, there are a number of problems with a reductive physicalist approach. The first thing we can say is that brain activity does not explain everything. Imagine we wanted to do an experiment to find out what it's like to revise for an exam or write an essay. And some neuroscientists came along and said, right, we'll put an EEG cap on you, and we want to just measure your brain signal kind of between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. every night when you're doing your revision. And that'll tell us everything that we need to know about what it's like to revise for an exam, right? Or not? What else would they need to do? They need to ask you, right? We need to talk to the person as well. You see, just measuring brain activity does not tell you everything you need to know about what it's like to revise for an exam. So it can't be that physical processes alone explain everything. There are actually different levels of explanation. Brain activity tells you the underlying mechanisms, but it doesn't tell you everything you need to know. It's a bit like saying programming languages tell you everything you need to know about Minecraft. Well, that's not true either. We need to talk to Marcus Persson, whose idea it was, who set the whole thing in motion. Brain activity does not explain everything. And scientific measurements can't tell you what it is like to be you. They can't get at your experience of the world. And this is at the heart of an area that is known as consciousness, or the problem of consciousness. Now, philosophers that are into this subject of consciousness talk about qualia, and these are qualitative experiences that are very difficult to describe. Imagine I came to you and said, okay, in physical terms, in scientific terms, describe to me the smell of coffee. Describe it. Anyone want to have a go? Yeah. Thank you, Tadil, over there. Paying attention. Good. You actually need to smell it. You can't actually scientifically reduce the smell of coffee any further. You need to experience it. The smell of coffee, for philosophers, is an example of a qualia or a quale. It is a qualitative experience. It can't be reduced anymore. No matter how many physical descriptions you throw at it, you're never going to get there. And this is known as the hard problem of how you get from physical processes to qualitative experience of the world. How you get from brain processes to what it is like to be you. And scientifically, it's a bit like the difference between, imagine you go to a music concert and you experience the multi-sensory onslaught that is a music concert. And you come home and you're raving to your friend the next day about it, and they start to Google it and look it up and look at the blogs on it and the vlogs. Well, science, the ability of science to access consciousness is a bit like the people that read the reports. You can only get so far. You can't recreate the experience itself. You can only observe it externally from the third person perspective. And so there are inherent limitations in what science can actually uncover about the subject of what it is like to be you. But certainly brain processes alone will not get there. Secondly, physicalism, reductive physicalism, undermines human rationality. C.S. Lewis puts forward his argument from reason, where he says that if it's true that brain reactions are simply the physical forces of nature, and physicalism says that all of our thinking is driven by non-rational forces, then why should we expect non-rational forces to lead to rational thoughts? Why should we expect non-rational forces to lead to rational thoughts? Why should we expect that one would lead to the other? And on that basis, why would you trust anything that your brain throws out? You see, the argument that you are your brain undermines itself. There's no reason to rationally accept it. If there's just neurons driving everything, how can you trust what's coming out? Thirdly, we know from clinical medicine that the brain doesn't just drive the mind also drives the brain. There are all kinds of examples of illnesses that have their root in the mind. There's also some research that's been done, lots of research that's been done, but medically there's this thing known as the placebo effect. You know, if you receive a blank treatment that you believe will help you with whatever the illness is, it will have some therapeutic value. It won't completely solve it, but it's very well documented clinically that there is a placebo effect. And this is an example of the power of the mind to heal the body. It isn't true that the brain simply drives the mind. It's not simply one-way traffic from the brain to your thoughts. Your thoughts also impact your brain. And fourthly, statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. There is a misconception that if a well-renowned and a very established and bright and brilliant scientist says it, then it must be true. And that is often the case when they're speaking within their realm of expertise. But when scientists start to step outside of their area of expertise and make metaphysical statements, that isn't necessarily true. We need to go back to the reason that Amy put out earlier. We need to check the facts and think about motives and ask personal questions and say, does this actually make sense of reality, or is there something else going on here? And it is my experience, and probably yours, and you'll be seeing from the lineup today, that actually there are scientists that hold all kinds of different beliefs on God. And there are some scientists that believe you are your brain, and scientists that believe you are far more than your brain. There are scientists who believe in God, and there are scientists who don't believe in God. My story is that I started a biochemistry degree as an agnostic. And I changed my mind about halfway through on the basis of what I saw in the life of Christians, of what I saw of the evidence that I'd never really looked at before, and how it made sense not only within itself, but it also made sense of reality. It made sense of my own life. And so statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science, so we need to really dig deep and check the facts. And the truth is that we live as though we do the thinking, not our brains. We don't live as if we are our brains. We live as if we have a mind. We live as if we are free agents, able to make meaningful decisions, and we have some degree of control over that. And so what I want to show you for the rest of the lecture, for the seminar, is that there are other ways to describe the mind-brain relationship that make more sense of life. And actually, they match up with neuroscience and philosophy as well. So another view that some people hold is that the mind emerges from the brain. In other words, the brain generates the mind. When a number of brain parts come together, something new comes into being, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And this is referred to as non-reductive physicalism. This is saying that the physical brain is all that is needed to generate the mind, but once the mind is a new thing that can't simply be reduced to brain parts. And if those parts are removed, then the mind goes away again. This view would also believe that the mind is dependent on the brain for its existence. Let me try and illustrate this using, the film of Avengers: Infinity War. How many of you have seen this movie? Excellent. Then you'll know that it's a movie about Iron Man, Thor, and the Hulk and other Avengers that group together to stop the evil Thanos from his plans for domination. What is a film? What is a film? Well, I talked this through with my friend and colleague Tom Price, who is an expert on film, and there are lots of different components. There are the actors, such as Robert Downey Jr., Benedict Cumberbatch, Scarlett Johansson, and so on. There is the soundtrack. There is the script, the set, the camera crew, and the directors. All of those things are needed to make the film Avengers: Infinity War. And yet, when you go to the cinema and you watch the film, you're not thinking about all of those different components. You experience this one thing that is the film. The film is bigger than its components. And yet, if you take away the script, you don't have the film, right? If you take away even one member of the cast, you don't have the film. Do you see? This view is saying that the mind is like the film, and the script and the cast are like the brain parts that come together to make this one thing that is bigger, but the two are dependent on each other. And a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers say, look, this helps us make sense of what neuroscience has been saying for the last 3 or 4 decades. When you give someone an exercise where they use their mind, their brain changes. The two are connected. And this view helps to make sense of that. And Christians and non-Christians hold this view. And some examples of Christians would be Nancy Murphy at Fuller Seminary and Malcolm Reeves in St. Andrews. The problem with this view is that when the brain dies, what happens to the mind? If the mind can't exist without the brain, surely this means that when the brain dies, that the mind dies with it. And if someone is a physicalist, then that's not a problem. But if someone is a Christian, how do you make sense of that? And there are all kinds of studies of near-death experiences that are actually becoming more and more systematic in the way that they have been studied in patients that have had to undergo clinical death in order to be operated on, particularly for cardiac surgery. So there's no heart signal, there's no brain signal, and between 7 and 10% of patients report consciousness during the procedure after they're resuscitated. And this initially was viewed with skepticism, but as more and more patients started reporting it, some of the facts that they report during that could be corroborated externally, and this has led to a very systematic area. It's potentially still in its infancy compared with its overall lifetime, but it does raise a question. Is this evidence that the mind can exist without the brain? As Christians, we wouldn't be relying on it as a proof, but if God does exist, then we can make sense of this kind of data to say, yes, there is far more to us than simply our brain, and therefore we would expect consciousness beyond the death of the body. The third view is that the mind is beyond the brain, and this is a view that is known as substance dualism, which says that the mind is a substance all on its own and the brain is a substance all on its own, and the two are distinct, but they do interact. But in this view, the mind can exist without the brain. A key proponent of this view was the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, well known for Cartesian dualism. But in Cartesian dualism, the mind is seen as an immaterial physical thing that has really nothing to do with the physical body, which is often parodied as the ghost in the machine. Your mind is this ghostly, floaty thing that sort of vaguely operates in the vicinity of your body, but the two are not connecting together very much. However, and some reject substance dualism today because they say it makes no sense of modern neuroscience. Modern neuroscience is showing that mind and brain are connected. Substance dualism is saying they're entirely disconnected. So this view doesn't make sense of neuroscience. But actually, it's important to say that there are other types of dualism, more holistic types of dualism, held by people like Professor Keith Ward, Professor Richard Swinburne, J.P. Moreland, that say actually mind and brain, although they are distinct, they interact very closely together, and so you can make sense of modern neuroscience with this view. Some raise the objection, but how can a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain? How can a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain? Well, there are all kinds of examples of the non-physical impacting the physical in life. You know, if you get some bad news about a loved one or a boyfriend or girlfriend, that can affect our appetite, it can affect our sleep. The prospect of exams, that's not a physical thing, that's a kind of a non-physical thing, but that can cause physical anxiety. And also something known as psychosomatic illness is a huge problem today. Illnesses which have no traceable physical root, but are very, very destructive. And so actually, the non-physical impacts the physical all the time. And so why not a non-physical mind and a physical brain as well? As we close, it's one thing to ask, what is the brain and what is the mind? It's really another altogether to ask, why? Why do we have a mind? If it's true that there is such a thing as the mind that interacts with the brain, then why? C.S. Lewis takes his argument from reason a stage further and says, look, the forces of nature cannot generate reason, and therefore reason must come from outside of nature. Our capacity to reason must come from outside. In other words, it must come from God. We have a mind. You have a mind because God exists. You have a mind because God has a mind. And God is a thinking, feeling, rational being who has made people in his image. And he has made you with some of his qualities. Almost his fingerprint is on you. His image is on you. And so you have a mind. You are so much more than your brain. because you have a mind, and you have a mind because God has a mind, and he has given that to you. And he's given that to you so that we can think higher thoughts, so that we can think about what am I here for? Not only how do I solve this maths problem, but actually really, what is the purpose of life? What is it all about? How can I know if it is real? And that mind is the means, the radio antennae, if you like, that leads us to God. He has wired us so that we have everything we need to know that he is real, that he is there, that he loves us, and that he has died for us in the person of Jesus Christ so that we can have life. You are so much more than your brain, but you have been given a mind. And to be a Christian does not mean to throw that mind away and stop using it. Actually, that mind has been given you by God. And in this room, I see people that will use their minds for all kinds of things beyond school and the future that you have. That's something to celebrate. That's not something to shy away from. That's from God.